The Valdrian Combat Institute perched on the edge of Nexus Prime's capital district like a particularly aggressive architectural statement, all sharp angles and crystalline surfaces that caught the triple sunlight and threw it back in patterns designed to intimidate prospective applicants before they even reached the front entrance. The building's designers had clearly subscribed to the theory that educational institutions should look like they could win a war single-handedly, which was probably appropriate given that the Institute's primary function was teaching the galaxy's future military leaders how to kill things with maximum efficiency and minimal paperwork. For 300 standard years, the Institute had maintained its reputation as the premier destination for beings who wanted to learn the fine art of organized violence from beings who had already mastered it. The curriculum covered everything from small unit tactics to fleet command strategies, with specialized courses in xenobiology, combat applications, and something called advanced intimidation techniques that was probably exactly as unpleasant as it sounded. The student body represented a carefully curated selection of the galaxy's most promising young killers, each species contributing their own unique perspective on the fundamental problem of making other beings stop moving permanently. The selection process was legendarily brutal, involving written examinations, physical trials, and psychological evaluations that were rumored to leave some candidates requiring therapy for decades afterward, which made it all the more remarkable that they had somehow ended up with a human. Training Hall 7 buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that happened when you gathered 47 different species in one room and asked them to pay attention to someone talking. The hall itself was a monument to practical brutality, with reinforced walls that could absorb energy weapon impacts, floors designed to provide optimal traction for beings with anywhere from 0 to 12 legs, and a ceiling high enough to accommodate species that approached combat from a distinctly aerial perspective. Commandant Qix'ral stood at the front of the hall, with the bearing of someone who had spent the better part of 2 centuries explaining why his way of doing things was superior to everyone else's way of doing things. He belonged to the Nexarian species, beings who had evolved on a world where the dominant life forms were living crystals with attitude problems. This heritage had blessed them with skin that looked like polished gemstone, eyes that could see into spectrums that most species didn't know existed, and a tendency toward intellectual arrogance that made academic philosophers look humble by comparison. Standing nearly 4 meters tall and possessed of the kind of angular beauty that suggested expensive sculpture more than biological evolution, Qix'ral commanded attention through the simple expedient of looking like he could cut glass with his cheekbones. His voice carried the crystalline resonance that made Nexarian speech sound like music, assuming the music in question was composed entirely of sharp notes played on instruments made from broken mirrors. The assembled cadets represented a comprehensive survey of galactic military potential. The Corvati delegation occupied the center section with typical efficiency, their metallic exoskeletons gleaming under the training hall's harsh lights. These beings had evolved from pack hunters on a world where everything was trying to kill everything else, which had given them reflexes like lightning and the social cohesion of a military unit that had been training together since birth. Behind them sat the Silithians, whose snake-like forms coiled around specially designed seating with fluid grace. Their species had mastered the art of warfare through deception and misdirection, turning combat into a form of deadly performance art that was beautiful to watch and absolutely terrifying to experience. The Valthak representatives had claimed the back corner, partly because their bulk required extra space and partly because they preferred to observe potential threats from positions that offered multiple escape routes. Standing 3 meters tall and massing roughly equivalent to a small vehicle, they approached warfare with the subtle philosophy that problems could usually be solved by applying sufficient force in the right direction. And scattered throughout the hall were representatives of dozens of other species, each bringing their own evolutionary advantages to the grand project of learning how to kill things professionally. Then there was Jake Morrison. The human sat in the 3rd row with the unremarkable presence of someone who had mastered the art of being simultaneously visible and forgettable. Average height by human standards, with brown hair and the kind of face that could blend into any crowd, he possessed the valuable ability to be completely overlooked by beings whose senses could detect heartbeats from across the room. His uniform was regulation standard, his posture suggested polite attention, and his expression indicated the mild interest of someone attending a lecture on historical agricultural techniques. The other cadets had initially attempted to classify him according to their various species threat assessment protocols. The Corvati had concluded he lacked any meaningful combat enhancements based on his obvious biological limitations. The Silithians had dismissed him as too straightforward to present any tactical challenge. The Valthak had filed him under not worth the energy expenditure and focused their attention on more obviously dangerous classmates. Only a few of the more perceptive species had noticed that the human spent an unusual amount of time studying his surroundings with the focused attention of someone conducting a very thorough inventory. Commandant Qix'ral activated the whole's attention system with a gesture that caused every light to dim except the ones illuminating his position. The effect was dramatic, theatrical, and exactly the kind of thing that Nexarian instructors used when they wanted to emphasize their superiority over lesser beings. Today we examine the primitive combat methodologies employed by various species before they achieved proper military sophistication, he announced, his voice carrying the tone of someone discussing archaeological curiosities. While modern warfare relies on energy weapons, quantum disruptors, and tactical AI systems, there exists educational value in understanding the crude techniques used by our ancestors during their pre-civilized periods. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably. The concept of primitive weapons struck most of them as roughly equivalent to studying ancient methods of food preservation or historical approaches to waste disposal, academically interesting, but utterly irrelevant to practical application. Your assignment, Qix'ral continued, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed watching others struggle with concepts beneath his considerable intellect, requires constructing a functional weapon using only materials present in this training hall. No energy sources, no modern technology, no assistance from your species' natural biological advantages. You have 72 standard hours to create something theoretically effective in combat scenarios. The Kovati immediately began examining the whole structural components with expressions that suggested they were calculating tensile strength versus destructive potential. The Silithians started testing the flexibility of various materials with movements that looked like elaborate stretching exercises. The Valthak surveyed the available space with the methodical attention of beings planning to build something very large and probably very dangerous. Jake Morrison continued studying the training equipment with the same focused intensity he had displayed throughout the previous weeks. Over the next 2 days, the training hall transformed into something resembling an archaeological reconstruction site run by beings who possessed only theoretical knowledge of archaeology. The Kovati had somehow managed to create what appeared to be a traditional warhammer using metal components salvaged from exercise equipment. The result looked impressively destructive and incorporated several mechanical principles that would have been innovative 3,000 years ago. The Silithian delegation had taken a more artistic approach, weaving together flexible materials into a complex arrangement of weighted cords that could theoretically entangle and incapacitate opponents. The construction was elegant, demonstrated their species' natural affinity for precision manipulation, and probably required approximately 6 months of practice to use effectively. The Valthak had approached the problem with characteristic directness, which meant they had disassembled approximately 1/3 of the available furniture, and were constructing something that looked like it had been designed to knock holes in starship hulls. Whether this represented a weapon or a very aggressive engineering project remained unclear. Other species had contributed their own interpretations of primitive warfare. The insectoid Qix'ral had created a collection of throwing implements that demonstrated impressive aerodynamic principles. The aquatic Narration had somehow fashioned a trident that could theoretically function underwater, despite the obvious limitations of their current environment. The gaseous Ithrim had managed to construct what might charitably be described as a containment device, though its practical applications remained mysterious. Jake had spent the first day simply observing. He walked around the training hall during break periods, running his hands along the surfaces of various equipment, testing the flexibility of components, examining construction materials with the methodical attention of someone conducting a very thorough structural analysis. Other cadets occasionally glanced in his direction, but his activities seemed so mundane that they quickly returned their attention to more obviously interesting projects. On the second day, he began to work. The process was so quiet and systematic that most of his classmates failed to notice it was happening. Jake started by carefully dismantling a single training apparatus, removing connections with precision that suggested familiarity with mechanical systems. He separated different material types, sorted components by size and structural properties, and arranged them in patterns that initially appeared random but gradually resolved into something that might generously be called organized. By the morning of the third day, The other cadets had begun to notice that the human was actually constructing something, though identifying that something remained challenging. He had created a curved piece approximately as tall as himself, along with what appeared to be a collection of straight projectiles and some kind of flexible chord arrangement. When Commandant Qix'ral called the session to order, he positioned himself at a safe distance from the assembled projects with the satisfaction of someone about to witness valuable lessons about the relationship between theory and practical implementation. "We will now observe each delegation's weapon demonstration," he announced, his crystalline features reflecting the training hall lights and patterns that probably looked impressive to anyone who hadn't spent the previous 72 hours listening to the sounds of furniture being systematically destroyed. "Corvati delegation, please proceed." The Warhammer performed exactly as impressive-looking weapons tend to perform when constructed by beings who understand engineering principles but lack practical experience with primitive materials. It looked magnificent, demonstrated several innovative mechanical solutions, and promptly broke into 3 pieces the moment it encountered anything more substantial than the training hall atmosphere. The Silithian cord weapon displayed the elegance and precision that characterized everything their species attempted. It moved with fluid grace, demonstrated remarkable dexterity requirements, and immediately tangled itself into a configuration that would require approximately 47 minutes to unravel. The Silithians accepted this outcome with the philosophical composure of beings who had prioritized beauty over functionality from the beginning. The Valthak construction worked precisely once, delivering an impact that cracked the reinforced testing surface and sent vibrations through the training hall floor that could be felt in adjacent buildings. The device then proceeded to disassemble itself with the mechanical enthusiasm of something that had been held together primarily through determination and creative application of friction. Other demonstrations followed similar patterns. The Qix'ral throwing implements flew with impressive accuracy before embedding themselves so deeply in the target surface that extraction required specialized tools. The Nereal trident looked appropriately menacing until practical testing revealed that wielding it required being submerged in approximately 3 meters of water. The Ithram containment device produced effects that were either profound or completely incomprehensible, depending on one's ability to perceive gaseous species communication. Cadet Morrison, Commandant Qix'ral called, his voice carrying the tone of someone who expected the final presentation to provide either educational value or confirmation that some species simply lacked the evolutionary prerequisites for weapons development. "Please demonstrate your construction." Jake stepped forward carrying what appeared to be a curved stick with string attached to one end. In his other hand, he held several of the straight projectiles that had obviously begun their existence as components of training equipment. His expression maintained the same polite attention it had displayed throughout the previous weeks, as if he were about to demonstrate something no more remarkable than a particularly efficient filing system. "I built a bow," he said, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone mentioning lunch preferences. The silence that followed this announcement possessed the quality of vacuum, vast and empty, and filled with the sound of expectations colliding with reality. Several cadets exchanged glances that conveyed the interspecies equivalent of profound confusion. The Corvati produced harmonics that suggested bewildered amusement. Even the Ithram seemed to condense slightly, apparently attempting to focus their attention more effectively. Commandant Qix'ral's crystalline features arranged themselves into an expression of carefully controlled patience. "A bow," he repeated, his voice maintaining the resonant quality that made Nexarian speech sound like expensive music. "You have constructed a primitive projectile weapon that operates through stored kinetic energy and manual targeting." "That's correct," Jake replied, apparently untroubled by the instructor's tone. "And you believe this device will demonstrate effectiveness in combat applications?" "I believe it will put these arrows through those targets with enough accuracy and force to be tactically significant." The targets in question were standard Institute training dummies positioned at various distances throughout the hall, constructed from materials designed to withstand energy weapon impacts, and built to survive the kind of abuse that happened when 47 different species practiced their preferred methods of destruction. Qix'ral's expression shifted through several configurations of disbelief before settling on the look of someone who had decided to allow events to proceed purely for their educational entertainment value. "Very well, Cadet Morrison. Please demonstrate your bow." Jake raised the weapon with movements that appeared casual, but possessed an economy of motion that suggested considerable practice. He drew the string back in one smooth gesture, the improvised bow bending in a curve that somehow managed to look both primitive and precisely engineered. The training hall fell silent except for the soft creak of stressed materials and the barely audible whisper of improvised components under tension. He released the first arrow. The projectile crossed the hole in a time interval that could generously be described as instantaneous. It struck the nearest target with a sound like controlled thunder, penetrating the reinforced surface and burying itself so deeply that only the improvised fletching remained visible. The target, which had been designed to absorb energy weapon impacts, rocked backward with a mechanical sigh that sounded remarkably like surprise. Before anyone could properly process what had just occurred, Jake had already nocked a second arrow. This shot targeted a dummy positioned at twice the distance, striking with the same devastating accuracy. A third arrow followed, then a fourth, each finding its mark with precision that defied everything the assembled cadets understood about primitive weapons technology. The silence that followed possessed an entirely different quality than previous quiet moments. This was the silence of beings who had just witnessed something that violated several fundamental assumptions about physics, engineering, and the relative capabilities of different species. Jake lowered the bow and stood waiting for questions with the patient expression of someone who had expected exactly this reaction. The first voice to break the silence belonged to one of the Corvati, who produced a harmonic sequence that roughly translated to how in the name of all sacred metals did furniture components just penetrate military-grade defensive materials. Physics, Jake replied, as if this explained everything worth explaining. Commandant Qix'ral found his voice after several seconds of processing what he had just observed. Explain the principles involved, he commanded, his crystalline features reflecting light in patterns that suggested intense concentration. The bow stores energy through elastic deformation of flexible materials, Jake began, his tone suggesting he was discussing something as routine as equipment maintenance procedures. When you draw the string, you're loading potential energy into the curved components. Release creates rapid energy transfer to the projectile, achieving velocities comparable to modern small arms without requiring external power sources or technological infrastructure. But the construction materials, protested a Silithian whose voice carried harmonic undertones of confusion. Training equipment components lack the structural specifications for serious weapons applications. Jake shrugged with a casual gesture of someone stating obvious facts. Depends on how you use them. Exercise equipment frames are designed to support significant dynamic loads, which means they can handle tensile stress if you distribute the forces properly. Flexible components have spring characteristics built in for user safety, which translates to elastic potential when you modify the geometry correctly. The key is understanding material properties and working with their inherent characteristics instead of against them. One of the Valthak rumbled something that might have been incredulous laughter. You created a functional projectile weapon from training hall furniture. I created a functional weapon from available resources, Jake corrected. The fact that those resources happen to be training equipment is coincidental. The principles work with any materials that possess appropriate structural and elastic properties. Commandant Qix'ral walked over to examine the target dummies, his movements carrying the careful precision of someone approaching something that might be more dangerous than initially assumed. The arrows had penetrated so deeply that extracting them required considerable effort and creative applications of leverage. When he finally worked one free, the projectile showed minimal damage despite having just punched through materials designed to stop plasma discharge weapons. Remarkable penetration characteristics, he muttered, turning the arrow over in his crystalline hands. The kinetic energy transfer exceeds theoretical expectations for such primitive construction methodologies. Not really primitive, Jake said. Just simple. Sometimes simple solutions work better than complex ones. The remainder of the session dissolved into an extended technical discussion that ranged from materials science inquiries to philosophical debates about the relationship between sophistication and effectiveness. The Corvati wanted to understand the mechanical advantage calculations involved in draw weight optimization. The Silithians were fascinated by the precision requirements for consistent accuracy. The Valthak peppered Jake with questions about force multiplication ratios that he answered with the casual expertise of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about practical applications of basic physics. Other species contributed their own perspectives on what they had witnessed. The Qix'ral declared the demonstration a profound lesson in the importance of understanding fundamental principles before attempting advanced applications. The Narration suggested that the bow represented an elegant solution to the problem of projecting force across distance without technological dependency. The Ithrim offered observations that were either deeply insightful or completely incomprehensible, depending on one's ability to interpret gaseous communication patterns. As the session ended and cadets began filing out to process what they had experienced, Commandant Qix'ral remained behind to examine the bow more closely. The weapon looked exactly like what it was, training equipment components held together with improvised connections and practical engineering solutions. Yet it had just outperformed devices created by beings with access to advanced materials science and thousands of years of military tradition. "Cadet Morrison," he called as Jake prepared to leave. "Yes, Commandant. This bow construction of yours. How long did the design process require?" Jake considered the question with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else. "Maybe 4 hours to work out the optimal configuration. Most of that time was spent testing different component combinations to find the best performance characteristics." "And the actual construction time?" "About 6 hours total. Could have been faster, but I wanted to avoid damaging the materials unnecessarily during disassembly and modification." Qix'ral stared at the bow, then at the punctured target dummies, then back at the bow. 6 hours total. Approximately. You created a weapon system capable of penetrating Institute-grade defensive materials in 6 hours using nothing but training hall equipment. "And some improvised string for my personal gear," Jake added helpfully. "The synthetic materials they use for equipment connections aren't really optimal for bowstring applications." The Commandant's crystalline features shifted through several configurations that his species used to express concepts without direct translation in most languages. The closest human equivalent might have been something between profound respect and existential bewilderment. "Tell me, Cadet Morrison, what would you have constructed with access to proper materials and unlimited time?" Jake smiled for the first time since the beginning of the course. "Probably something very similar, but with better string and more consistent arrow weights." In the days that followed, word of the demonstration spread through the Institute with the velocity that interesting news achieves in closed communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. The story evolved in the telling, as stories invariably do, until some versions featured Jake constructing a bow capable of penetrating starship armor, while others claimed he had somehow managed to violate fundamental laws of physics through pure determination. The more accurate accounts simply noted that the human exchange cadet had demonstrated that effectiveness and sophistication were not necessarily equivalent concepts. Commandant Qix'ral found himself fielding inquiries from colleagues who wanted to understand how primitive projectile weapons had suddenly become relevant to modern military education. His initial response was to classify the incident as an interesting anomaly, but subsequent reflection forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about assumptions, expectations, and the difference between complex and effective. The bow itself was eventually placed in the Institute's Hall of Significant Innovations, where it occupied a position between a quantum targeting system that had revolutionized fleet combat and a tactical AI that had solved the previously impossible problem of coordinating multi-species unit operations. The identification placard described it as improvised kinetic projectile system, human engineering, and noted that it had been constructed entirely from training equipment in under 10 hours of total effort. Visitors to the hall often paused at this display, puzzled by the inclusion of what appeared to be modified furniture among artifacts of genuine military significance. The Institute guides learned to explain that innovation often emerged from unexpected sources, and that the difference between primitive and advanced frequently depended more on perspective than on objective measurement. The Institute eventually incorporated a new course into its standard curriculum, Resource Adaptation and Field Engineering, which was formal academic language for how to build effective solutions using whatever materials happened to be available. The course proved popular with cadets from technologically dependent species, though whether this popularity stemmed from practical educational value or from entertainment derived from watching classmates attempt to weaponize common objects remained unclear. Jake Morrison completed his exchange program with performance evaluations that were unremarkable except for perfect scores in primitive weapons theory and practical engineering applications. His final assessment noted exceptional innovative capabilities and superior adaptive problem-solving skills, which was Institute administrative terminology. For this cadet accomplished something we thought was impossible, and we still don't entirely understand how. He returned to Earth carrying recommendations that described him as tactically creative beyond conventional parameters and capable of achieving mission objectives through unconventional resource utilization. These descriptions would later prove valuable during application processes for positions requiring innovative thinking and the ability to succeed with limited resources. The bow remained in the Hall of Significant Innovations, serving as a reminder that effectiveness and complexity existed in a more complicated relationship than most beings assumed. Institute cadets continued studying advanced weapon systems, energy manipulation theory, and quantum combat applications, but they also learned that sometimes the most elegant solution was also the simplest one available. Years later, when Commandant Qix'ral had advanced to senior administrative positions and spent his time developing theoretical frameworks for tactical education, he would occasionally visit the hall and contemplate the bow that had fundamentally challenged his understanding of innovation and adaptation. He never determined exactly how Jake had calculated optimal stress distribution using only visual estimation and practical testing, though he suspected the answer involved less advanced mathematics and more of the peculiar human talent for making functional solutions from inadequate materials through persistent experimentation. The most ironic aspect of the entire situation was that the Institute's Ancient Warfare Methodologies course had been designed to demonstrate the superiority of modern military technology over historical approaches. Instead, it had proven that innovation depended less on access to advanced resources and more on understanding the fundamental principles that made those resources effective in practical applications. Which, when Jake Morrison learned about this interpretation during a reunion visit years later, made him laugh in the quiet way that humans laugh when they realize the most important lessons are often the ones nobody intended to teach in the first place.